All right, so I guess we're going to get started here. My name is Greg Hallich. I'm moderating the session. And then Stephanie, Sarah, and what's the last name? Williams. Sarah Williams we're both really the moderators, and we'll both try to keep us all in time. I'll be talking third on, so this is extended season grazing around the world. Hopefully we've got a pretty good cast of presenters here to give you a little flavor of that. Our first presenter is from the University of Missouri. Harley Newman is going to start us off, which is really applicable where we're at right now in Kentucky, but that's using stockpiled fescue to help us extend that grazing season. So Harley?
Let's see. All right, thanks for being here. So many of you probably are going to know much of what I'm going to talk about here, but we'll introduce it pretty fundamentally for those that may not. So, and I'll be speaking on this topic from kind of what we know and what we've learned in Missouri. So basically, you know, our forage base is this cool season perennial grass, right? Tall fescue in the state of Missouri and all across the fescue belt, which Greg mentioned is applicable right here in where we're at as well. And we've got some real gaps in production here, and so one of those gaps that we often talk about, and one that we spend a lot of time focusing on, is this gap in the summer when our cool season grasses go. Basically, they stop being very productive largely across the state. There are some areas in Missouri, and specifically North Missouri, where that's maybe not necessarily the case. But what we're focusing on here is winter feeding. And so I'm going to talk about stockpiling tall fescue from that standpoint to kind of fill these gaps over here, right? These larger gaps that we've got in the wintertime. So starting off, for anyone in the room that may not be familiar, right, what is stockpiled tall fescue? Basically, it's where we would take livestock off of a designated pasture area, and we would allow that area to grow in this fall period. So if you look at that white bump there, maybe from, depending on weather, right, maybe from September to November. And then we basically defer the grazing on that, all right? And so we graze that or manage it in such a way that we can continue to graze rather than feed stored forages throughout that winter period. And so we say we really like where I'm at, we really like tall fescue in the fall. Why is that? It's almost all leaf if it's well managed, right? It's vegetative material, as we see in this picture. If it's well managed, we can produce 1 to 2 tons per acre of this fall grass, and it stockpiles really well, right? It sticks around through the winter period very nicely because it's got this waxy cuticle on it, and that waxy cuticle is basically in this, if we look here in this cuticle layer, right up here in that area, it's basically composed of these epicuticular waxes that do a really nice job of protecting the leaf from degradation through snow events, rain, excessive rainfall, ice events even. As soon as the ice or the snow melts after one of these weather events, you basically have this really nice green material still there because of this waxy cuticle. Gives it a great advantage over something like orchard grass, for example, that doesn't stockpile so well. So another consideration that we might think about in terms of why we would want to stockpile this fall grass is a lot of herds in our region are fall calving herds. And so if we look at this figure here, basically just want to draw your attention here to this physiological stage. This is low lactation, medium lactation, and high lactation, and how that relates to potential intake of the herd. And so we see that here at this high lactation is basically where intake is going to be the greatest. And so then you think about, well, where does that line up if you're in a fall calving herd? And it's somewhere over here, right? Where if we're not stockpiling grass, what do we end up doing here is feeding hay. And so this stockpiled grass actually affords us an opportunity maybe to feed less stored forage, right? And so I don't want to say that hay is any kind of a problem, but it presents us some challenges, right? And so one of the challenges is the cost, right? Hay is definitely going to cost more than our stockpiled grass. And in an analysis that was conducted by one of our ag economists at the University of Missouri, Wes Tucker, he came up with this figure right here of hay feeding costs about $1.76 per cow per day, using some of these assumptions here, compared to stockpiling of 86 cents per cow per day. In an independent evaluation at Virginia Tech, they came up with only a 3-cent difference. So I feel pretty confident in numbers like this. And so if we do just a little scenario, right, here we've got, if we had a 40 cow herd, $1.76 a day, and if we fed for 3 months, it's north of $6,000 cost for that period. And a lot of producers are going to feed for 4 months and some even 5, right? So it does cost more than stockpiling. Nutritive value of stockpile fescue is greater than that of hay. So in a study that we conducted several years ago at the University of Missouri, we've got stockpiled tall fescue, 12.5% crude protein, 60% NDF basically, and the typical quality of the hay that we produce in the state. And this is an average of a lot of different analyses that we've conducted. 7.5% crude protein and 65% NDF, so higher fiber, lower protein, poorer nutritive value. If we want to look at ADF, so the less digestible fraction of fiber, this is kind of interesting. So stockpiled pasture over the course of the winter doesn't change a whole lot in terms of the fiber content as ADF, but look at how much less it is compared to the nutritive value of the hay. Then another issue, right? Ergovaline, the toxicity of Kentucky 31 tall fescue. Same study here. Basically, the ergovaline concentration, we watch it decline in stockpiled grass throughout the winter period. You compare that to hay where it's fairly stable, right, in that product. And so some advantages there. Now, one thing I will say is kind of a watch out here, and I'm going to talk about utilization at the very end, but you don't want to overgraze your stockpile, because in the fall, that ergovaline concentration is greatest, and it is concentrated in the lower 2 inches of the canopy of the grass. And so if we overutilize our stockpile, you can get yourself into a situation where you're getting into the toxic tall fescue. So how do we do this? Well, there's a recipe, and it's fairly simple. This is what we found as best practices where we're at. And so the first thing we do is we graze it, right, if we can, to basically reset the pasture. All right, so if you can use the grazing animal to keep the material vegetative throughout the grazing season, that's what we're after. Right? That's the least cost probably method of doing this reset. If you've got a lot of reproductive materials, seed heads, stems, that kind of stuff, then sometimes we'll have producers that we recommend to go ahead and clip the pasture, so getting out the equipment and mowing, brush hogging, that sort of thing. And then add some fertilizer, right? And so I'll just give you some scenarios, some questions basically that we get that might answer I might try to answer right here. So when we're talking to producers about stockpiling, one of the big questions is, well, when should I apply nitrogen? And this is based on I'll give you a couple of scenarios here, but if you apply in early August the 1st, what we saw in a 3-year study conducted in North Missouri is that we had a response of basically 2,900 pounds per acre to that early application of nitrogen. Compared to August 15th application, you get a little bit of a decrease, as you see here, and then if you apply as late as August 29th, we got an even further decrease in the amount of forage that we were able to produce. One thing I'll say about that is usually around August 1st in the state of Missouri, we are really hot and very dry, and so it's really counterintuitive to go out and be applying nitrogen at that time. But what we found time and time again here is that by doing that early application, you get a greater response down the road. Other question is, how much nitrogen should I apply? Okay, this can be a highly debated topic, right? But if you look here, there's no secret that cool season grass responds to nitrogen, right? So we had, in this 3-year study that was conducted back in the early 90s, nitrogen rates of 40, 80, and 120 pound per acre. And the greatest rate got us the greatest nitrogen response, right? The greatest forage response to the nitrogen. If you look, that's 3,062, right? So 3,000 pounds per acre over this 3-year project. Well, here's a different study that was conducted in the early 2000s on the same farm. And this gives us a little bit more information, but if you notice 2001, 2002, and 2004 are all of these lines here, right? And so they took the nitrogen rates up considerably higher, so up to beyond that 120 from that last study to 150, and then all the way out here to 300. And so there's a, you see a pretty nice response out to the 150, and then out here you basically see that kind of the diminishing return for your investment in nitrogen. This line here is a lot more similar to that last study, right? That 3,000 pounds out here at the peak, or if you think about where that 120 is, you notice the one thing that seems to be driving that potentially is this precipitation from June to August. It was lowest in that year at 4 inches, even though from August to harvest, it was about the same as the other years. That summertime precipitation seemed to maybe be driving that a little bit. Another caution with regards to stockpiling fescue. It definitely has a negative impact on your legume population, right? So we had red clover stands that we were measuring in the subsequent spring following our stockpile. And if you look here in 2002 to 2005 is basically the same response where the red clover population is concerned. So these rates, right, the same as what we saw in that nitrogen response curve, 50 up to 300. And in all cases, we basically saw that there was a decline, right, with increasing rate of nitrogen. There was a decline in the red clover population in the subsequent year. You can knock them out of the system with too much N. Another question that we commonly get, how long should I defer the grazing? Right, well, that same study that was conducted in the early 90s gives us a little bit of some insight there into that question. So if we look from, we had harvest dates of October 4th, 25th, November 15th, December 6th, and how much dry matter we can accumulate, and basically found that November 15th in these particular 3 years gave us the greatest amount of dry matter to graze for stockpile. And then beyond that, right, dry matter starts to decline some. So essentially this fescue will, as long as conditions are right, it will continue to grow even into November. If you got a mild early winter, it'll grow even into December. It just depends. And so essentially you want to defer the grazing as long as you can until cessation of growth really occurs, right? And that's how you'll maximize our accumulation of stockpile. So one other thing I want to talk about is utilization. There are, depending on what your objectives are, we can get greater utilization out of our stockpile fescue, or we can get less utilization depending on how we manage that. So we've observed that if you go in and you do just set stocked, continuously grazed critters on an area of stockpiled fescue with no management, you'll get considerably less utilization out of that stockpile than if you strip graze it. So in case there are any in here that aren't too familiar, we're looking at this figure right here. This is an example of strip grazing, where you might have water set in one spot, and you've got this temporary fence, and you basically just march that temporary fence across that pasture, allocating a different amount of forage on a daily basis, or maybe it's on every 3-day strip allocation, maybe every 5, maybe every 7, right? Depends on what your objectives are. But you allocate a certain amount, and you move that fence on some frequency. And in this particular example, you see that there's no back fence. you're in a situation where that fescue may continue to grow just a little bit, then maybe you do want to back fence so they're not going back and overgrazing the material, right? So there are different things that you might do in your management to prevent that from happening. But essentially what we've observed is that the fewer days we allocate the livestock, the greater utilization you're going to get out of that stockpile. So you stretch it a little bit further, right? And so in a recap here, because I'm just about out of time, we stockpile tall fescue to extend the grazing season, improve nutritive value on offer. If we want to make the most out of it, apply the nitrogen earlier, right, rather than later. Defer the grazing until cessation of growth so that we can accumulate as much as we can, and then strip graze to achieve greater utilization. And so with that, say thank you. I don't know if we have time for a question or not. Yeah. So, all right. Questions? Comments? Very good. When do you recommend starting grazing? Stockpiling in the fall. So that would be in line with your August nitrogen application. So if you apply nitrogen on August 1st, if you're in kind of this mid-latitude region, then you want to be you want that pasture to be reset, and you want to be off of it with livestock at that point in time. Hey, Katie.
Hey there. How do you talk with producers about the risk of fertilizing maybe during drought conditions and that trade-off, especially with fertilizer prices the way that they've been?
Yeah, I always say right up front that honestly this is a gamble, right? So there's some risk involved, and it may not, how much nitrogen you apply needs to pencil out. If you're going to apply it, it's certainly a lot less risk if we're getting the rainfall or we've got the predicted rainfall pattern. For us, last year we were in a tremendous drought, and we're still in that, although we've been getting some rain where we're at this year or this week. But we've got to see how it goes. If you're in a drought, it's hard to recommend in any good faith to anyone to go out and apply the nitrogen. Yeah. Yep.
Have you ever compared the commercial nitrogen use, soluble nitrogen, to animal waste and poultry waste for stockpiling?
We have not, or I have not personally. There may be my predecessors that have looked at that, like poultry litter down in Southwest Missouri, for example, where we're closer to that. No, most of the work we've done recently and on the farm where those data came from were different forms of inorganic N. Yep. Yep. Any others? All right.
So here in Kentucky, tall fescue is definitely our mainstay to extend that grazing season, and just our mainstay in terms of forage resource for grazing. The farther south you move, and we have a little bit in Kentucky, but not much, but the farther south you move from Kentucky, the more that Bermuda grass is really gonna be a viable option for that. So our next presenter, John Jennings, who recently just retired from the University of Arkansas, is gonna present in terms of how we use Bermuda grass to do that.
I like to walk around a little bit, so I'm going to take this off of here. But appreciate the invitation to come give this presentation. And Like Greg said, I did recently retire, and if I wasn't here today, I'd be fishing right now. But I also want to recognize Kenny Simon, who's our instructor in the animal science department. He's one that conducts our on-farm demonstrations where some of the data that I'm going to talk about has come from. He does a great job managing our 300-day grazing program as well. So we'll get into this, and I'm going to be talking about stockpiling warm season grasses, perennials, with Bermuda grass as the example, but it also, the same procedure works with Bahia grass and with Dallas grass if you have those two forages. The yield is not quite as great as Bermuda grass, but it's still an effective method for the extending grazing on those forages. So I'm in Arkansas, but what I'm going to talk about will fit any of the Bermuda grass growing areas of the United States and other parts of the world that have like temperatures and climatic conditions. You just have to adjust the calendar a little bit from the dates I'm going to talk about. So it depends on where you are as how much adjustment that you might need to make there. But the principles are still the same. So I'm going to first start out talking about a common forage system. And this system I want to talk about if you have a Bermuda grass or perennial warm season grass base. Whereas Harley was talking about, you know, the tall fescue, whereas you get into more northern Arkansas, Missouri, and, you know, on up through the upper Midwest, that's a very common forage, and stockpiling fescue is a very strong option for extending the grazing season. But as you move farther south, we have less and less fescue, so we look at stockpiling other options. So if we have a Bermuda grass base, the typical common forage system is we have the Bermuda grass, and sometimes we can start grazing it by mid-May. This year's been a little bit cold earlier, so we're not quite grazing on Bermuda grass yet, but we're getting close. The weather's warming up, and usually by early October, the growth is finished for the year. It may still be green for a little bit longer after that, but it's usually finished growing. So that's our growing season for Bermuda grass in a typical year. So what happens after that? We have a lot of season left here and a lot of season left here with nothing there. So we feed hay, and we feed more hay until we're really tired of feeding hay. And then what do? We bale hay, and we bale more hay until we're really tired of baling hay. And so, you know, what do we do to try to fill out this season? So we surveyed producers a few years ago when we've kind of increased this effort across the southeast. But here's some Arkansas numbers where we asked them, producers that were attending conferences, you know, what's their typical practices for their hay procedures, you know, the hay harvest and the hay feeding. So when we asked them, this is 2015, 2017 hay harvest time, number of cuttings, the average that they reported is about 2.2 average across those if you can get 0.2 of a cutting, but usually 2 cuttings a year, and they'll tie up about 95 hours of cutting in that. And that's for cutting, raking, baling, hauling, equipment repair, fertilizing, weed and insect, pest control. So they have about over 200 hours tied up in the harvest and storage of the hay crop in a typical producer for 2 cuttings a year, 200 hours. There's no other practice that I could recommend to a producer that says it's going to cost you 200 hours to do this, and they would do it. But they'll bale hay every year. So and then we've continued that survey. What about hay feeding? Okay, we had 2 different years here that I'm showing numbers for. The first one was 2015, 2016, and those producers in that survey averaged 110 head of beef cattle. The total hay feeding days that year is 122, fairly mild winter, 1.6 hours per day, so about 195 hours hay feeding, just feeding, not all the other procedures with it during the wintertime. So again, about 200 hours. Another year, 2017, 2018, was a long, extended winter. Winter didn't let go in the spring. It stayed cold. They had to feed hay a lot longer. So similar sized farms, but now we're looking at 175 hay feeding days, hour and a half a day. That's 263 hours. And you can see if we put an estimated cost per day, you know, the numbers can get very high on total cost. So hay is an expensive process, harvesting and feeding, and so the every day we can cut out of that is, you know, contributes to the bottom line. So what can we do? So we look at the strategery of hay. That's not really a word, but I think it fits here. We bale hay all summer and we feed hay all winter. The key point is growing a pasture crop takes exactly the same management as growing a hay crop. exactly the same management, but we try to do it with a pasture crop. You want to do it for each season of the year and not just for that hay harvest season. So we look at what can we do. So again, we look back at our calendar, and here's our Bermuda grass growing season. And so if we tack on one practice of that same forage, but just managing part of that forage differently, that stockpile Bermuda grass can fill out a grazing season through that fall. And depending on where you are and how mild the winter is, that might extend out in here a little bit later into the winter if you have enough acreage. So I'm defining stockpiling, and I think is already done previously, but stockpiling forage is just simply the practice of accumulating forage in one season intended for grazing in a later season. So that's what we're doing with our Bermuda grass. Try to grow it somewhere here so we can graze it here. Now, there are some characteristics of Bermuda grass that makes this counterintuitive. It doesn't make sense. Bermuda grass is a perennial warm season grass. How are we going to get it to grow so we can graze it in the fall when it's cool? Optimum temperature for Bermuda grass is 29 to 35 degrees C. That's about 85 to 95 degrees Fahrenheit. It needs to be warm. Okay. Growth slows rapidly when the night temperatures drop below 10 degrees C. That's about 50 degrees. And when it gets down to about 40, Bermuda grass is done for the year. I don't care where you are, who you are. When Bermuda grass hits that temperature, it's done. It still might be green for a while, but it is not going to grow. And the same way in the spring, it does not grow well until those night temperatures get warm. And so it's not always daytime temperatures, because we get warm temperatures in September, and many times 90 to 100 degrees in Arkansas. But when those nighttime temperatures dip down, it stalls it. We can get a 50-degree night, and it'll take it a week to get over it. It'll stall it. And it might warm back up in the day, but if the nights stay cool, it just gets less and less and less. And so that's why we have to start on time. And I'll show you some research that backs that up. This is work that Dean Scarborough did with Wayne Koblenz at the University of Arkansas, and they did this at Fayetteville and Batesville. And these are the numbers from Fayetteville, where they looked at this 2 different years, where they initiated the stockpiling of Bermuda grass in early August and early September. And the first year, where they initiated in early August, and when they harvested later in the fall, they got 1,600 kilograms of dry matter. That's take 10% off of that, and that's about pounds per acre. And September, you see they only got 567. So if they delayed from August 1st to September 1st, 65% decrease in yield. 2001, he had 4,700 pounds, much better growing season that year, or 4,700 kilograms, about 4,500 pounds. 730 if they waited till September 1st, an 84% decrease in yield. So you have to start this on time. It's not the warm daytime temperatures that affect Bermuda grass stockpiling, it's the warm nights. And you have to have enough warm nights to accumulate this forage. And so it's very important you start on time. And for a lot of people, that's kind of a problem. And I'll talk to you more about that in a minute. It's kind of a mindset thing. And I think Harley already alluded to that. So we look at the stockpile forage quality, and you can see you can see how the cattle will graze it. It looks like a lawnmower has been out there. They will really clean this up if it's done properly, just like this field has been, where that wire was just moved about 30 minutes before those cows were turned on that new strip. But if we look at the quality of the stockpile Bermuda grass, typically we'll accumulate it from early August until sometime in October. And if we look at the total digestible nutrients, TDN, there in early or mid-October, we're right around 60, sometimes up to around 65%, but right in, pretty good quality range, mid-50s, mid-60s. We look at this lower red line, that's the TDN requirement for an 1,100-pound dry cow. This is the TDN requirement for 1,100-pound lactating cow, and you see nearly all the numbers are above that dry cow requirement, and quite a few of them are above the requirement for that lactating cow. Crude protein, we're looking in October, a lot of those are in the mid to upper teens. And even out here in November, December, they're still right up in that range. And you can see the quality starts dropping off when we get toward later in December. And that's when we start getting a lot of freezing weather, freezing precipitation, things like that. And that's when we recommend that you probably should be finishing up grazing that stockpile Bermuda, because freezing precipitation will basically ruin it. If we get snow on it or ice on it, When it melts off, the cows just refuse it. But before that, they clean it up very well. And so the chances of that when we get past mid-December increases more and more as we go in the winter. So you try to plan the acreage you think you can graze out by first of the year, and then you have stockpile fescue, winter annuals, some other forage to try to fill in the gap from that point on. So the quality can be quite good, especially for dry cows. Early on, it can be very good for lactating cows. So we look at the typical savings that we've measured on our farm demonstrations. For stockpile Bermuda grass, the average or the range will run $20 to $60 per animal unit. And grazing days per acre, grazing days per acre usually runs about 65 to 110, somewhere in that ballpark. And we've seen a little bit more, but we have seen a little bit less, but significantly more on some other projects. So just to give you a couple of definitions, an animal unit, define that as the amount of forage consumed by a 450 pound or 1,000 pound animal in one day. And savings per animal unit, we calculate that as the cost needed to stockpile and graze that forage compared to the cost that would have been required to produce that hay and the supplement required to match the performance of the cattle and the grazing days that we got out of the stockpile. And so we graze through it. We know how many cows, what performance they did, how good of body conditions they stayed in, and the number of days we grazed, and then we back calculate how much hay at the cost for that producer of whatever hay it would have cost him, it would have taken to replace that. And so that's how we make our savings estimates. Okay. And we know that strip grazing, just like was mentioned before, that does improve our utilization, but on our demonstrations, we have seen on average it doubles the amount of grazing days that we get compared to just turning them out and let them graze the whole stockpiled field. And the typical producer likes to move their polywire about twice a week, 3 to 4 days per grazing period. And it saves an extra $10 per animal unit versus continuous grazing, and also 1 to 2 hours a day hay feeding time that they don't have to do, whereas they move that wire twice a week instead of having to feed every day. So we look at some more results. This was a larger operation. You had 391 animal units, grazing 147 acres of stockpile Bermuda grass. He got 143 animal unit grazing days and saved over $11,000 that winter compared to the hay that it would have taken to replace that grazing. And just a couple of comments from producers. One said, stockpiling is the most impactful single practice of my grazing operation. It provides more dependable grazing than winter annuals and usually produces about another 60 days of grazing. And that's from a producer in central Arkansas. Another producer made the comment that it takes me and my 6-year-old son about 35 minutes twice a week to move an electric fence wire on stockpile Bermuda grass to feed 250 cows. He said, there's no way I can feed hay that fast. And so it's a very reliable practice. Stockpile fescue and stockpile Bermuda grass in our 300-day grazing program have been probably the two most reliable forage practices that we have to extend the grazing season. So why don't producers use more stockpile Bermuda grass? Well, it's hot, dry weather in August when we need to initiate the start of grazing, or start the stockpiling. And many coffee shop experts, and often ag dealers, I have even heard this in person, warn against applying nitrogen, particularly urea, during hot, dry weather. How many of you have heard that? How many of you heard that if you put on nitrogen, urea, when it's 90 degrees, you're going to lose 50% of it? That is not true. Okay, here's some data. This is some work that Nathan Slayton and some of his students conducted there in Arkansas, where they compared pelleted poultry litter, urea plus agrotane, and ammonium nitrate. The first year, pelleted poultry litter produced about 6,000 pounds of dry matter, urea 6,800, urea agrotane 67, ammonium nitrate 67. No significant difference and almost no numerical difference that first year between ammonium nitrate, urea, or with agrotane. The second year, ammonium nitrate produced significantly more, but you look at, there's 700 pounds difference between that and urea. So urea is still a very effective tool for stockpiling Bermuda grass. Now, we did a study more recently where we compared ammonium nitrate, urea plus MBPT, which would be like an agrotane type product, urea and Anvol and UAN, and the urea and urea plus the MBPT weren't significantly different than ammonium nitrate. Numerically, there was about a 10% difference, and that's typically what we see on all the studies that we have done in the last 15, 20 years is about a 0 to 10% difference between ammonium nitrate and urea applied on Bermuda grass in the summer. And so if that's the case and we're putting out 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre, put on another 5 pounds. And that covers that risk, okay? You do not lose 50% of it. And I cannot find data that show anywhere a study that shows 50% loss. The biggest one I've been able to find was in Arkansas. It showed 28% loss, and that was where they put on 30 pounds a month. Okay. So, some recommendations. Start date, remove the existing forage residue in early August, and leave it to a stubble about 2 to 3 inches tall. We want all that old growth off there. If they didn't eat it first time, they won't eat it the second time either. So we need to clean it off just like a hay cutting. Put on 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen in early August. We can go to mid-August in South Arkansas. So the further south you go, you can change that date. Defer grazing till late October, let forage accumulate. Strip or rotationally graze it, and our grazing period is October to December under our conditions. So there's a study that Paul Beck did, and it's published in Journal of Animal Science, where he took Bermuda grass base. He pulled out, this was stocked at 2 acres per cow over a 3-year period. He pulled out 25% in August, stockpiled it. When he went on to the stockpile Bermuda grass, he pulled out another 25%, planted wheat and ryegrass mixture. So he was able to graze stockpile into the winter, and then graze the ryegrass late winter and spring, and he's back to Bermuda grass. How many forages is that? How many procedures is that? It's a very simple process. He fed a little bit of hay in the fall sometimes to let his stockpile accumulate, and then a little bit of hay in the spring before the ryegrass caught up. So he was able to get a 351 days grazing at stocking rates of 2 acres per cow, 0.8 hectares on a 3-year study. So forage truths I've learned, it always rains after a drought. You cannot dispute that. You cannot predict the weather conditions 30 days from now. You can predict your forage practices 30 days from now. Nitrogen losses of urea when applied during hot weather are lower than commonly believed. Stockpiling works greater than 90% of the time. Always plan at least 1 season ahead, because this is all these practices you have to plan to put them in practice and put them on your calendar. They do work. We have producers that do it all the time. They say, I know it was hot, it was 90 something degrees, I knew it was time, I went ahead and put it on, had the best stockpile I've ever had in my life. We hear that comment frequently. But the ones that are afraid to, oh, it was too this, too that, too hot, too dry, my dealer told me not to do it, and then 3 weeks later it started raining, by then you're too late. If you start September 1st on this, you're too late. You got to start on time. So, in case I didn't say it, always plan at least 1 season ahead. Okay. All right.
Do we have time for any questions? So we have time for one question.
So out of all the cow-calf producers in Arkansas, do you have an idea about like what % of them are actually using stockpiling?
We've done surveys through some of our extension clientele, and of that group, it's very common for about 25% to report that they do. Now, of the total producers in the state, I'm not sure it would still hold at that number, but of the ones that regularly use extension recommendations, about 25 to 35%. I think there's kind of a sense of pride in being out there, and you cut that and you bale it, and I did that.
Yeah, I agree.
But and for a lot of them, it's a recreational practice. So.
Good study.
All right, so I'm going to introduce the next speaker. Happens to be myself. So Greg Hallich. So I'm going to try to set the tone again. So the focus here is extending the grazing season. I'm actually going to talk about feeding hay, but feeding hay in a way that we are getting the most benefit from it, also reducing our labor and equipment costs, hopefully. And by the way, feeding hay in a way that actually resembles grazing very closely. So that's my introduction to it. And let's get going. Let me say one quick thing. So this essentially is going to be about a 16 minute summary presentation of a 45-minute presentation I usually describe as an introduction to bale grazing. So obviously you're not going to get all the detail. You're going to get very few of the details on this. It's a summary. So this is kind of what it looks like in most situations when you start. You're going to see lots of pictures here, so we'll just kind of go through. Here's an aerial view. I like to show this just to make sure everyone's kind of on board. So wherever you're storing your hay, whether it's side of the field or in storage somewhere, sometime before you need that, hopefully after growing, after the grass has stopped growing. So in Kentucky, that would typically be like early November to late November, somewhere in that time frame, people are going to start setting hay out. So put it out where you're going to be feeding on pasture, kind of checkerboard fashion, at least long term. You want to have a distribution like that. You're going to start from your water source, kind of like strip grazing, and from that point onward, it's going to be like rotational grazing. In fact, I call it rotational grazing with bales. So you're going to set up your temporary fencing, in this case 3 bales. You're going to go through that. That might be one day in one farm, it might be a week on another, very flexible. Go through that, you set up your next fence, do the same thing, and then you're slowly moving across that field or pasture. Again, that may be 1 week on one farm, might be a month on another. It's very flexible in terms of how, and the nice thing is you're doing this during the dormant season, so you're not so concerned about back grazing with that water source for the most part. So a few pictures here. There's a cross fence that's been set up so that they just moved the cattle into that new pasture sometime that morning. The water source, you can't actually see it. It's off to the right about 150 feet or so, but the cattle are going to slowly move across that pasture. I think it's about a 25, 30 acre pasture. Almost all the farms that I've personally worked with, so I've personally been bale grazing for about 13, 14 years, starting on one of my farms, and I've been working with farmers like this one for probably about 10 years or so. Until this year, every farm that I've worked with has ended up using hay rings. Obviously the trade-off is you have less hay waste with the rings, but you'll have more labor and you'll have the expense of the rings with them. There's one farm that started this year that is not using hay rings, and they definitely, their waste is a lot higher than what I'm used to seeing. I like to tell people to think of hay as potential nutrients. Obviously it's feed for your cattle, but it's also a source of nutrients. But I highlight potential for very good reason, because depending on how you feed that, you may or may not get back that potential. The typical ways, or most of the ways that we feed hay here in Kentucky and the upper South, we're wasting a lot of those nutrients. So look at that picture. That's the potential in terms of what we may have out there. The next picture is not going to be that same spot. It's going to be on the same farm about 3 weeks after I took that picture at about that density, and you can see the potential that they got there. So pretty good, right? Now, you're only seeing the dung, of course, so multiply that by 2, and that's actually about the distribution you got. So they got really good potential back from that hay that they fed. I'm going to show you 3 different densities just to give you kind of an idea here. So I always tell people, some people ask how far apart should I put the bales. I always recommend tons per acre, because it depends on the size of the bales. So I've got low, medium, and high there. Low density is 2 tons of hay per acre. Just roughly, if you're using 5x5 bales, that would be about 4 5x5 bales on an acre. So we're not talking very dense, right? They're scattered about pretty good. In Kentucky and most of the South, the problem that we have is, and by the way, the high at 6 tons an acre, if you're bale grazing in, say, North Dakota or Saskatchewan, that would probably be on the low level for them. Now the reason, and when I started doing this in Kentucky, I quickly learned I had to adapt that. I can't do what they're doing farther up north, because our soils are so wet in the wintertime that we will pug them up. So the first thing I learned very quickly is we've got to reduce the amount of hay that we feed. We just need to spread over more acres. But what I want you to do is look at even that low density, And this would be the units or pounds of NP and K. It's in pounds per acre, so kilograms per hectare, or increase that by about 10%. But you can see that is still a pretty good dose of fertility for a pasture situation. That's assuming 75% is recycled back into the pasture, which we should be able to do a little bit better. If we go up to four tons of medium, then we're talking about really significant amounts there. That, again, in most pasture situations, we probably don't really need that much at one time. The one thing that we don't really talk about and we don't have good data on yet is so we can talk about the raw chemical NP and K, but when we feed hay out on pasture, in addition to that chemical fertility, we're also getting what? We're getting organic matter out there, right? It's hard to quantify in terms of benefit, and we've not done that yet. We'll talk about a grant that we're involved in that we're going to try to do that to some degree. But my best guess is that may be as important or more important than the raw chemical NP and K for the long term, because with that organic matter, you can stimulate soil biology, especially on really degraded soils. I'm going to show you just one summary slide of the only really good bale grazing research that's been done, in my opinion, and that was Paul Youngnich, University of Saskatchewan. What he did was really simple. He just took a cow herd, divided in half. Half the cows were bale grazed on pasture at higher densities. We'll talk about that. The other half was fed in a dry lot, and then all the manure was scooped up at the end of that first winter and spread back on the equivalent amount of pasture as what was bale grazed. So again, one summary slide. There's lots of good data in terms of soil nutrient concentrations, but I'm going to give you one just on the forage response. So this is over 2 years. So we had the control, the pasture, the dry lot manure was spread, and then the bale grazing pasture. So the control was about 2,000 pounds per acre, which I'm assuming in Saskatchewan is probably not that bad. In Kentucky, that would be incredibly poor production. The dry lot increased by almost 50%, so it looked really good. It actually surprised me. It looked good until I do what? Until I show you how much they got with the bale grazed pasture. So they more than doubled the production compared to the pasture that they spread the manure back onto pasture. Now, of course, they couldn't get 100% manure, right? But this was a controlled experiment at the university. I talked actually to Paul Youngnich a number of times. He was at ministry, the agriculture ministry, and he still maybe, it's been a couple of years, but he assured me they did a pretty good job of scooping up the bulk of that manure. So it wasn't 100%, but it was probably 85, 90%. So how on earth could we have that discrepancy in terms of production given that? And which is the question there. Let me give you a hint. What is something that cattle urine has in it that might be important to production? So in a typical forage-based diet, about 2/3 of the nitrogen will be in that urine. And almost all the potassium, about 90%. Now, two quick questions. One, what nutrients are typically most important for hay production or forage production in most environments? Nitrogen, potassium. Second question is probably more important. How are you going to capture that urine in a typical feeding pad or dry lot situation? So unless you have something like a composted bedded pack barn that you've got 2 feet of carbon on top that is viable for a dairy operation, but it's never going to for a beef cattle operation, at least here in the United States, how are you going to capture that urine? And they couldn't conclusively come to this, but most likely the difference was probably just strictly due, or most of it due to that urine loss when they tried to spread it. So I've done the broader presentation. Lots of farmers are potentially interested in bale grazing, but their biggest hang-up is usually this question right here. They're concerned that they're going to damage or destroy their pastures by bale grazing. And I'm quick to point out to them that, yes, if you screw up bale grazing, I've seen people screw up bale grazing, it's not, I mean, we think sometimes like rotational grazing, it should be simple, right? But there's a lot of ways you can screw up rotational grazing. So it does take some time to learn well. Hopefully you've got some teaching you. But yes, you've got to be careful. It's a concern. But done well, done correctly, done with care, you'll have some damage. It's just not going to be considerable. So this is not worst case scenario, but it's kind of what I would put on the upper 90th percent or so in terms of damage I would see. So this farm, they got probably 1.5 inches of rain 2 days before I took the picture, and the cattle were on it for about 2 days. You can see roughly where the hay bales were. And outside where the bale was, that's what I call the impact zone. That's where the hooves will be behind that bale ring. So imagine that cone around that bale. That's where that damage is going to occur. And probably 95% of the damage or higher in that pasture is all going to be in that cone, that impact zone. Very little is going to be outside of that. So, you know, you can look at it for yourself. But that's typically what you will see in a situation like that, where we had a significant rainfall event. But almost all that damage is there. If I take a picture just to the left of that, which I'll show you here, you can see animals were still there grazing, right, but almost no damage whatsoever to that part of the pasture. So imagine 4 of those bales per acre. That's all the damage I had even after that significant rainfall event. But that's why we have to keep those densities low. So here is a really, this will take a little bit of time. It's probably not going to happen the first year. But after 2 or 3 years, once you get comfortable with bale grazing, you can really reduce your machinery and labor costs. I'm just going to show one example, given the time constraints in terms of how that was done. So this farm, this was the 3rd year they bale grazed. First year, just like about any farm, they made mistakes. They weren't comfortable putting out the bulk of their hay at one time. By the 3rd year, they were, and this is where the bulk of the time savings occurs, is sending out a good chunk of the hay at one time, half or better. So it was late November. They set out 68 bales. They were mixtures of 5x5s, 5x6s. And I was there, so I can verify this. It took them just under 4 hours to do that, 2 people. One with a loader tractor, the other with a pickup truck with a trailer in the back. They got that all set out just in checkerboard fashion, just under 4 hours. And they did not, so this farm was actually about 5 miles from the home farm, so this is even more important. They don't have a tractor dedicated to that farm, so they did not have to bring a tractor out for about 100 days, from late November until early March. And on average, they would move that fence about every 5 to 7 days, and it would take them about 45 minutes to 1 hour to do that. So call it moving once a week, about 1 hour in terms of labor. That's a 40 cow herd. Now think about a typical 40 cow herd if they're feeding any other way. How many hours that would be? Now the last benefit I'm going to cover is something I never even considered probably 5, 6 years ago. And right now, if this was the only benefit I would get now, I'd still do bale grazing just because of this. So let me explain. On my farms, I finished cattle, and I never fed hay any other way. So I never was used to seeing cattle in the wintertime covered in mud. But once I started with other farms working on their winter feeding, I quickly saw that isn't always the case. A lot of cows have what in the wintertime? A lot of mud coated all the way down to them. So this is something it took me a few years to really realize, working with the other farms. But let me point out, so on this particular pasture, so there was about 6 inches of snow about 2 days before I took this picture. It melted pretty much all off in about a day and a half, but you can see where the cattle were, because they're walking around there a little bit, helping with. But the point I'm trying to make here is that they're kind of constrained in that area. The water source is to the right, kind of at the very bottom, southeast corner. But if you look at where the bale is right now, there is mud around that bale ring, because you had about six inches of snow that melted very quickly, and so it's very wet. But the cattle aren't stupid, right? They're not going to sit down in that small spot that's mud. They're going where? They're going where it's dry. And they're getting, about every 3 or 4 days, they're getting a new section. They're moving, and they're not going to do enough damage in those other areas in 3.5 days to make it really any areas that are muddy. So they're constantly going to have areas that are clean, not necessarily dry, but clean when they lay down, so they're not going to get that coating of mud. What I'm going to do now is show you the one farm I worked with that has used kind of the main 3 ways of feeding hay in Kentucky. The traditional sacrifice area, this picture that they sent to me from years ago, what they claim, in my experience, by the end of the wintertime, pretty much any sacrifice area is going to look kind of like that. Then an ag engineer convinced them that a feeding pad was the salvation of their winter feeding problems. This, by the way, was at the end of the first winter that it was built. Does it look like it worked as designed? Now, the third way that they started feeding is bale grazing. Now, this is probably above average picture for this farm. It's, you know, the lighting is perfect. It looks like the sky is coming down, shining on the calves. By the way, this is fall calving herd. So think about all those feeding methods. Which of those is probably better for health conditions for those calves? Something like that. Now, if I picked an average picture for this farm, you know, a dreary day in the wintertime, it probably looks like that. But you can see it's still a very good environment for those calves, for the cows to be. Again, think about if you're a cow, if you're a calf, which of those three situations would you want to be in? The last thing I'm going to do very quickly is we have a grant from NRCS to look at bale grazing on actual farms. So this is not going to be done on research stations. It's going to be on-farm demonstrations and research. These are the 6 states involved. We've got members from 5 of the 6 states here at the convention. I think 10 total members, something like that. And so it's going to be spread out kind of in that geographical area. Last slide, and then we'll have a little bit of time for questions. This is a farm that I've been bale grazing for about 13, 14 years. This picture was taken, I don't know, 5, 6 years ago, so probably after 8 years of bale grazing. That is in mid-January. That's without any nitrogen, and that probably had 45 days of stockpiling, you know, late in the fall. And that is kind of typical for that farm after that amount of bale grazing. The organic matter has been raised enough where I don't need any commercial nitrogen. In fact, I've never put a pound of commercial fertilizer on that farm. So, questions?
You mentioned you bale graze with hay rings.
I do,
How do
personally.
you do that?
So the bale rings are round, right? So you just have to get them flipped up and then you roll them to the next one. So generally I don't actually feed in one given winter in checkerboard fashion. I used to, but then I realized it's more efficient to have maybe 2 lines closer together, have the same overall density. So I may only be moving 50 feet at a time. Yeah, you flip the ring up and roll. By the way, they make poly rings now that are about a half to a third the weight of the steel ones that work really good for bale grazing. Question?
At the end of the bale grazing season, do you recommend dragging to spread dung and also better distribute your hay residual that's left?
So the question is on what do you do at the end of the grazing or bale grazing season? Should you drag or harrow? That really depends on how much hay wastage you have and the soil biology of your particular farm. I've been amazed the farms that patch just don't break down, but it's, I think, because the soil biology is so dead that it's going to, and I've been on farms that those manure pats, every single one of them will be gone by the middle of May, every single one. So I can't say definitively, it will depend on that situation. Also, how much hay wastage you have. If you have a lot of hay waste, you may want to do that. Alex?
Any rules of thumb you can offer on when you're running, if you've got fall calving, how do you make sure that the calves get access to the rings? What number of rings you're going to have per cow in order to allow space for the calves to get in there and eat too?
So one nice thing about fall calving, and this was by accident, the first farm I worked with was fall calving, the calves were getting underneath the fence, and at first it annoyed them. They kept trying to lower it until they figured out having your calves on the other side of that fence where you have a little bit of stockpile and they can get in the middle of those bales isn't such a bad thing. It's one of those things where if you can't beat them, join them. They finally figure out that's not a bad thing, and I've worked with other farms that just decided the same thing. We want those calves on the other side. We don't want them getting stepped on by a 1,400-pound cow. Lendl?
Yeah, and you may have mentioned this, but what time of the year are you setting your pattern out? Are you moving the hay out from the dry to put out?
So the question is, when should you move that hay out? So when you're beginning, one year we set all the hay out at one time, late in the fall. I can't remember exactly where. But generally, especially when you're starting out, my recommendation is maybe set out about a third at one time. Don't set, you're going to have to gain confidence, and maybe even less that first year, because most people aren't going to have the confidence to know, I want that much set out. In other words, if you screw things up, it's going to take a lot of effort to change at that point. But in general, let's say in your second year or so, set out at least 1/3 of the hay, because a lot of the efficiency of, and I'll get to when set out, but a lot of the efficiency in reducing your special machinery costs is you can move a lot of hay once you have everything in place and you're rolling, right? But if all you're doing is you get everything set up and you do one load, then you've got to start that whole process over again 2 weeks later. When to do it? So in Kentucky, and I don't know conclusively as you head south from here, but in Kentucky for sure by the end of November, if you set hay out at that time, it is going to have so little degradation by the end of March. I mean, so little that I can say you know, don't even worry about it. Now, if I go from end of March into late April, all of a sudden I've probably lost 10% of that bale. So if that hay is set out during the dormant season, it's the biology that's breaking that hay down. So if the same biology that helps that grass grow is not cycling yet, it's also not going to break that hay down. So again, in Kentucky, late November for sure, you can set that hay out without really having to worry about that hay rotting. Now, in Arkansas, it may be December, I don't know for sure, or southern, I don't know those dates there. I can only tell you kind of Kentucky. So, our next presenter is also going to kind of show you how to feed hay, but before we actually turn it into hay. So swath graze, in other words, instead of actually putting it into bales, cut it, swath it, and basically avoid the expense of actually turning it into actual hay. So that our presenter here is Vern Barron. He is from Agriculture Canada, and he's located in Lacombe, Alberta.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and talk to you about swath grazing. So we've been working on swath grazing probably for about 25 years at the Lacombe Research Center, and I'm just going to try this pointer. Oh, it actually works. So here we are, Lacombe, Alberta, about 52 degrees latitude north. The area that's well adapted to swath grazing is this temperate area above the semi-arid part of the northern Great Plains. About 80% of the beef cows in Canada reside in the provinces of Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba. So it's ideal because we have about 450 millimeters of moisture annually, and our falls are cool and dry, and so we don't have a mud problem. So the overarching beef industry problems are, like everywhere else, the high cost of overwintering the beef cow. Annually, it would take about 1,300 to 1,500 Canadian dollars to get a beef cow and calf through 1 year. And the cost of feed bedding and pasture represent 56 to 71% of the production costs. So to kind of break down the cost that we're looking at, as well as the problem that we have in front of us, which is the high cost of winter feeding, we can break costs down into the feed cost and the yardage cost. The feed cost, if we're talking about producing barley green feed or cereal silage, it would be the cost of growing the crop, planting it, and getting it through to the point of a large round bale, for example. So that's the feed cost. The yardage cost then would be the cost of actually feeding that large round bale to a group of cows. The yardage cost is a constant cost because it's made up of the operating cost and fixed costs of getting that feeding done. So our average pasture cost, and I often use the Manitoba Agriculture spreadsheets, average cost of pasture in Western Canada is about 90 cents a day. Extended grazing practices might be anywhere from 65 cents a day to $1.50. And winter feed cost, the cost of winter feed, whatever it is inching up over $2 a day. And this is because increasing cost of fuel and increasing cost of repairs and equipment. So that's the feed side. On the yardage side, the same applies, increased cost of equipment and repairs. So the total cost of feeding a cow at this point in 2021 is getting up around $4 a day. So if we were to look at this particular extended grazing cost, it's not hard to visualize that you could save yourself at least $1 a day. When we started doing this work, our objective was to reduce the cost of overwintering beef cows by 50%, and you can kind of think about that put together with the previous slide. And at the time we were thinking that we'd be just happy to reduce or eliminate the cost of harvesting, hauling, feeding, processing, and manure removal. So what is swath grazing? To us, swath grazing would be to plant small cereals or any other crop really that could be mixed with it, planted at a time when we maximize yield in mid-September. Swathing would occur then. It's relatively dry, so the swath remains in the field until about the 1st of November when cows are weaned, and then the dry cows go out on the swath from about the 1st of November to within a month of calving, which could be the end of February, early March. So the research we do at Lacombe is done in 1.2 hectare paddocks that are replicated. On the upper, let's see, that's my left-hand side, would be an ideal swath for swath grazing. It's spring triticale yielding about 12 metric tons per hectare, about 6 meters wide or 20 feet wide between the swaths. We want the largest swath we can get because the crown of the swath will minimize the depth of the snow on top of the swath and allow cows to go through and procure the feed. We also want a substantial stubble, and that stubble should hold the swath up, allow air movement beneath it, and allow it to dry or cure so it doesn't spoil until the time we turn cows out. We also like the stubble there because we hope that it holds the swath up above the ground and prevents the swath from freezing to the soil in times of rainfall and snow melt. So cows are turned out, and we turn them out in 3 to 4 day grazing periods based on cow weight and constant allocation. So we have variable stocking rates. The cows move up and down the swath and open them up. They train themselves, and we expect to have somewhere around 80% utilization. To give you an example of the feed cost, I put together this mini budget of swath grazed barley, hay, and silage at about 2018 level costs. And you can kind of think again here is for hay and silage, this would be the cost from planting to putting the hay up in a large round bale, getting it ready to feed, or the silage in a bunker silo. So as we compare that to the swath, which is laying in the field, it has minimal operating equipment costs and fixed costs, and that increases as we go from swath to hay to silage. The swath grazing cost is approximately 70% of the cost of hay production for feed on a per hectare basis, and about 50% of the cost for silage. We'll use the term daily feed cost quite a bit, and that would be this total feed cost divided by the carrying capacity, which is cow days per hectare. So this is an example of one of our highest returns, I suppose, to swath grazing that we had. And in this case, we're comparing completely fed hay to stockpiled grass and swathed oats. And in this case, the feed cost was significantly lower from the grass because you don't use any equipment or fuel in that practice. But both of them were significantly lower than producing hay bales. The yardage cost was also lower for the swathed oat and stockpiled grass. In total, they were about 50% the cost per day for feed and yardage totaled compared to fed hay. And one thing we found quite useful is to express this savings that we might get compared to a fed control to 100 cows for 100 days, because that's what we would hope producers would aspire for, 100 days of grazing. And that would save them approximately either $118 a cow or $120 a cow, and on a herd basis about $12,000. A combination of swath grazing and hay would reduce that savings to about $4,000. So where do our savings come from when we compare this to the control cost, which could be a hay silage mix or straw hay mix? They come largely from the yardage side, and you can see it's quite a bit larger than in the economic category than the crop savings, but you can make savings in both depending on the comparison of the yield of the swath grazed crop compared to the control. So the big deal is, and these numbers are somewhat comparable to what John Jennings was talking about, 100 days grazing with 100 cows would save you about 112 hours of work, which is very important for both spouses if they're working, and 2,500 liters of diesel fuel, which has both cost and environmental implications. So I showed you two really good trials where we made substantial savings. I think everybody would agree if you could do that, you'd do it all the time. But we had times where across 5 trials that I'm comparing and showing you here today, we had times when the savings was about $4,000, 100 cows for 100 days. So that comes about from the variability in the yield that you may get from late planting to be able to harvest in September. It comes about from dry years, that sort of thing. You see the variability, about 37% for the CV of yield, and this is oats, barley, and triticale. And then the carrying capacity, because they're so closely connected, the CV is about the same. Pasture days, we always aimed at 100. We got about 108, and we stocked our paddocks to get that. The utilization averaged 76%, but the minimum, which is pretty bad, was 32% in one year and 49% in another. But we've had really high as well. The CV there is 21%. So there is risk involved here. So the smart guy in the audience would probably say, well, what do you really need to convince yourself to move from a traditional feeding system to swath grazing? In the first trial that we did, we learned with barley, with late planting, to expect to have yields somewhere between 6 and 8 metric tons per hectare. And that would deliver to you a carrying capacity somewhere around 600 cow days per hectare. And these utilizations in the first years were pretty high. In that work, it was concluded that we needed to have at least 50 pasture days and about 300 cow days per hectare for carrying capacity. So if you were that low, it wasn't worth your while to move. And in most really, I would say hotshot farmers would tell you they can do way better than that. So the important relationships to think about are a high linear relationship between dry matter yield and carrying capacity. It's about an R squared of 0.9. A moderately high but inverse linear relationship between carrying capacity and cost. Higher carrying capacity, lower cost. This relationship is modified by utilization, and low utilization reduces the carrying capacity and produces a higher daily cost. So I've eliminated some of the things that we could talk about in terms of agronomic factors, but the question always is these are intensive pastures that are high yielding with small grains. You're turning over a lot of dung and urine. Can you reduce the amount of nitrogen fertilizer that you would use? So when we first started doing this, when I took over the swath grazing work, I assumed that we would need about 100 kilograms of nitrogen per hectare because that's what is recommended in the region for small grain silage production. But when we did our soil testing, we found we had a considerable amount of nitrogen left in the soil. So I reduced it in half, and as we went through the years, I continued to reduce it down to the point where at this time, when we're repetitively swath grazing, we're not applying any nitrogen. So why can we do that? Well, I'm not going to put you through looking at the other graph, but I will just say that the nitrogen uptake by these crops is over 200 kilograms per hectare. The total of the calculated excreta plus residue is about 186. And the soil with a high organic matter can release about 60 kilograms of nitrogen annually. So that balances itself, but again, we're holding a lot of nitrogen in the soil and can get relatively high nitrate levels in the swath. So the last part of the talk will deal with the cow side and quality. And quickly, why can we even think about doing this work? If you look through here, this is the daily energy requirement of a cow after weaning a calf in the second trimester of pregnancy. And that's about as low as her energy requirement will be. And so we can feed some of these medium to lower quality forages this time and even expect to gain weight. Although the energy requirement is probably about 20% higher for swath grazing cows than pen-fed cows. We have to be careful about the last part because they can lose weight. Over the entire winter, we can expect small grains to decrease in forage quality with time. The slope of the line here from September to March of barley and triticale is about the same. We found that corn remained constant in terms of quality. Finally, however, we do have times when we're swath grazing relatively low quality feed because barley, for example, may have leaf diseases and yield is reduced by 25% and IVTD lowered by about 4%. And so where we have low quality feed, we're losing considerable amount of weight over that period of time for the cows, and we don't let them go below a body condition score of 5. On the other hand, with stockpile grass, which is high in quality, we did gain weight. Comparable pen-fed cows over this period of time would gain about 32 kilograms. So in summary, swath grazing can reduce costs of winter feeding by as much as 50%. Savings are variable and related to yield and percent utilization. Fertilizer nitrogen rates may be reduced compared to hay and silage production, but this will not be for all land and all soils and all management conditions. Weathering damage to forage quality may occur, and reductions should be expected. Reductions in carrying capacity and weight loss. Occasional low utilization may be more of an issue to feed procurement and cow weight loss than weathering to forage quality.
Unfortunately, we don't have time for questions right now at the end, and if you stick around, when we're all done, we'll stick around. We can answer any questions you want. Our fifth speaker is Andy Dumpledon. He is going to be talking about using winter annuals to extend that season. This is something I've had a lot of interest. I've only personally been able to try it a little bit, so we're going to be very interested in what he has to do here. Andy is from New Zealand. He's with PGG Rights and Seeds, and I assume they also sell here to the United States and Canada, right?
Hello. I'd like to just do a little summary on how we use forage brassica in both New Zealand and Australia. I'd just like to acknowledge my co-authors, Gemma Box and Glenn Judson, for putting this paper and presentation together. Look, forage brassica, we all know broccoli and cauliflower. As humans, we consume them. But we've developed a whole range of brassica species in which we feed to grazing animals. You can see there on the left, you've got your forage rape, your Raphnobbrassica, which is an interspecies cross between radish and kale. You've got your turnips, both leafy turnip and bulb turnip, your kale, which is the same family as your cabbage, and your Swedes. And so we've developed a whole range of these cultivars to feed to grazing animals. The history in New Zealand is all about a pretty recent farming system. So the early development of land and the introduction of livestock was very large tracts of land, and they were stocked to meet the lowest level of feed supply, which is during the winter. But as farming intensified, these large areas were subdivided and they were fertilised, and then all of a sudden the feed supply and demand curves became imbalanced. This is just a really typical feed supply and demand curve. We've got two islands. We've got a North Island and the South Island. Both have quite different feed growth curves, but you can see there the real crux of this problem is that we've got a winter deficit here and a summer deficit when pastures don't meet the grazing animals' needs. And so this is where forage brassica really steps in. So we've been using these forage brassicas in both New Zealand and Australia for over 100 years. So, they're not a recent crop. Currently in New Zealand, it's the largest sown annual crop with about 400,000 hectares of crops sown each year, about half for winter and the other half for summer. And these have become a real critical part of the grazing animal system. And all these forages, both pasture and forage brassica, are grazed in situ. And what we try to do with our forage brassica crops is we strategically plant them to provide a large volume of very high quality feed that can be used in either the winter and the summer. When we talk feed quality, the brassica has a similar feed test to a cereal grain. So, I describe the forage brassica as like you're feeding a green grain crop. So these are just some little examples of how we use these forage brassicas. So this is milking cows, and this is bulb turnip. So what we do is, quite often the milking cows are grazed during the morning, and then they might graze the bulb turnip, behind a electric fence for 3 to 4 hours after the morning milking, and then they go back onto pasture after lunch, and then they have an evening milking, and so that happens every day. So about a third of the dairy cow's grazing diet during the summer is the bulb turnip. So that's a classic summer use of forage brassica. This is a winter use. So this is again a dairy cow. She's been dried off, so she's not milking, and then over winter she's fed a daily break of swede, which is a bulb crop, and silage. And you can see there where yesterday's break was, and it's back fenced to keep them out of the mud. So every day they're fed a daily allowance of forage brassica. It's not on the cows which are fed forage brassica. There's a huge amount of sheep fed forage brassica also, and this is a very similar system. You can see the electric fence there. It's already been set up for the next day's break, and every day we shift that fence, and those grazing animals get given a fresh break of forage brassica. So that's swede again. This is an example of grazing lambs on a summer brassica. So this is a Raphno brassica. So it's a cross that we developed where we cross kale with radish in order to produce a drought-tolerant multi-graze species. And this is what it can do. So this is in a really dry part of the South Island of New Zealand. You can see how dry it is. The pasture is all burnt off. And so this is grazed by sheep. And then sheep are moved off this paddock, and within a month later, that's the amount of regrowth that we're achieving with this Raphno brassica. So a little bit about the plant breeding. So how do we develop these forage brassicas? So we very much follow what I call the plant breeding technology roadway. We started with population improvement, recurrent mass selection, and so it was probably about 30 years ago. That's the tools that we're using. From that, about 20 years ago, we moved into inbreeding, so selfing plants and creating inbred pure lines. And then more recently, in the last 10 years, we've moved into F1 hybrids, so using a vegetable brassica type breeding system. You might ask, well, why go to all the bother of F1 hybrids? Well, it's all about this yield increase. We're trying to get more yield, and we're also using the F1 hybrid system to stack traits into this breeding, into the breeding material. And these are the type of traits that we can stack into it. So this is the F1 hybrid, and this is the difference in disease resistance that we're getting. So this is one of our conventional types, and there you've got an F1 hybrid there beside it, which is completely disease-free. I talked a little bit about drought tolerance. This is a really important part of our program. So we've been able to screen and select material that has got very high water use efficient. And look, this is one of our trials, and this is a forage rape planted around the outside, and that's one of our Raphno brassica lines. So that's producing more than double than the traditional rape side of things. We also have a herbicide resistant program. So this is very similar to the Clearfield type technology in canola. So we've created a point mutation that enables us to apply sulfonylurea herbicides to this forage brassica material. And it pretty much gives us a clean crop. So this is a brassica weed, and we're able to spray that out within our commercial crops. So that herbicide resistant thing is very important part of our breeding program. I talked about disease. We have clubroot, which is a very bad soil-borne fungus, which affects the forage brassica. If you repeat crop, you will eventually get clubroot. So we use molecular markers to give us multi-strain clubroot resistant in our breeding material. So, you know, we have quite a number of traits which we stack into the breeding material. We also integrate forage cereal with the brassica crops. So just remember when I first started that the pasture complements the brassica with regards to seasonal growth, but we've also introduced forage cereal within the pastoral rotation. So the forage cereal is grown for the carbohydrate side of things, whereas the forage brassica is grown for the energy side of things. So the two different feeds really complement each other. But more importantly, we grow the two for environmental reasons. So in general, forage brassica can cause excess nitrogen leaching, and this is due to a high stocking rate on a small area and lots of urine being present. What we've found is that when we plant forage brassica, a forage cereal, after the forage brassica crop, we're able to soak up all that excess nitrogen from leaching through the soil profile. And this is an example of how we do it. So this is where the forage brassica was, where it's been grazed, and we've gone in behind it and planted forage cereal. What we've found, and this is some work that we've done where we've actually measured the nitrogen losses with the different systems. So just stick with me. The bottom line here is fallow, so no urine, and then grass sown in October. What was really interesting, without urine, you still even get leaching. This is fallow plus urine, and then grass sown in October. So, you know, about 200 kilos of nitrogen leached. And this is us going in with the forage cereal after the forage brassica. And when we plant in July with the oats after the forage brassica, we're able to reduce that nitrogen leaching by up to 50%. So I guess the future, what we're finding is forage brassica crops really do complement a pastoral-based system, and even the next step with that is when we introduce forage cereal after the forage brassica to soak up all that excess nitrogen. We're using F1 hybrids as a structure to stack traits. So this is multiple disease resistance and herbicide resistant into the breeding material. And we're looking to try to develop different varieties of crop that absorb more nitrogen, and so that reduces leaching even more. We've really become really good at developing drought tolerant crops. So as the temperatures increases, we're really trying to find breeding material that has a high water use efficiency. And we're really starting to look at climate change and how to breed crops to cope with higher temperatures as they increase over the years. So yeah, any questions?
No, you go first. Mine was, I was just curious, it's not a brassica, but chicory. Do you also do breeding and work on chicory?
Yes, we do. Yes, so we breed both perennial and annual grazing chicories also.
On the slide where you had the drought tolerance brassica,
Yes.
What was the daily temperatures there?
Oh, look, we can get up into the low 30s, and in Australia, even up into the low 40s. So, you know, we've got that operating in both countries. So it comes from the radish side of things. So radishes are very drought tolerant, and so we're able to cross the two species and bring that heat tolerance from the radish.
I just wanted to ask about the cereal that you put in after the brassica.
Yes.
Did you put it in, because it looked in there like in a strip, so as soon as the brassica went in, you put it in a strip, or how did you establish that?
Yes,
after?
so that was one of our controlled experiments where we
Okay.
had fallow ground
Okay, so
measuring.
you would normally just go straight in and do the whole field?
Yes.
And is that a specific variety for, because you call it forage, we would just say cereal, but...
Yeah, so we've been breeding forage oats, which have extensive root systems. So we've been breeding for below the ground biomass, which sucks up all that excess nitrogen. So we've almost been able to double the root system from a very small oat plant, which causes that big reduction in nitrate leaching.
And so would you typically graze that then, or...?
So you can either graze it or bale it. So, farmers, they can graze it after the brassica crop, or they quite commonly take that oat through for a silage. You can do either.
Thanks.
So you talked about potential nitrogen leaching associated with the brassicas. I've heard from some that there are potential issues with regard to nitrate accumulation in these plants to levels that might be harmful to ruminants. I'm just curious if you're aware of anything like that.
Yeah, so that's why I call it a green grain crop. So it is really high quality, and if you give complete access to the crop, you can have quite severe animal health issues. So this is where the allocation of feed and the transition into the crop and having a hay or silage source is really important. So you have to be careful with it.
Well, relating to this, maybe I missed it. To what extent do you recommend can forage brassicas be fed, for example, to a dairy cow as a pure feed?
Yeah, look,
can you give a percentage figure for that?
Yes, so we only recommend for a lactating dairy cow up to a third of its diet.
A third.
But in situations where we've had severe droughts in the North Island of New Zealand, we've had a lot of lactating cows eating almost 100% of their diet as brassica and just a small percent of maize silage, because that was the only feed available on these farms. So it's not what we recommend, but in drought times, farmers have to make do with what they've got, and we've been able to do it successfully.
Once more, you mentioned that you grow forage rye after the brassicas in order to avoid nitrate leaching.
Correct.
I was wondering whether you also consider to do mixtures of brassicas with forage cereals.
We do.
Growing them together so
Yes.
you wouldn't.
So we also mix forage brassica with forage oats, plus also annual ryegrass. So it's very flexible on how it can be used.
Any last questions? Vern?
You may have answered this, but do you have to deal with any sulfur-containing and equality metabolites and glucosinolates in your brassicas?
Yes, we do. So in the kale species, so Brassica oleracea, we have to be careful with what we call SMCO, which is the sulfur amino acids. So we breed for low levels of SMCO in the oleracea species. Now in the Brassica napus species, which is the same family as canola, which is the forage rape and swede, we also have to breed for low glucosimilate. More importantly, the progoiterin, because that compound can cause quite severe animal health issues when grazing forage brassica. So we've developed screening systems to reduce those to next to nothing.
Any last questions?
Are sheep and cattle grazing the whole bulb usually?
Yeah, so sheep and cattle are grazing the whole bulbs. So we like that because the protein is usually in the leaf and the energy's in the bulb. And so we like our grazing animals to have a mix of the two. And that's where, 1 day breaks or 2 day breaks are really important, because it forces the animal to feed a mix of the two. If you leave them just to it, they'll graze all the leaf and not the bulb, and that provides a feed imbalance in the diet. Yep. Yeah, we do, particularly with lactating dairy cows. They tend to be quite hungry, especially after the morning milking. And this is where yield is actually really important. So a low yielding bulb crop with bulbs about the size of the fist, there is the risk of choke with those. But where we're growing, 10 to 14 ton crops, bulbs as big as a bowling ball, we just completely remove that risk of choke. So yeah, it's something we have to be careful of.
All right, so Sarah's going to switch out the presentation. I'm going to introduce the last speaker. Brett Shedsoy is with Cornell Cooperative Extension. I actually know Brett because Brett is the person that taught me how to bale graze about 15 years ago, although that has nothing to do with his presentation. Brett and his family also, Brett is from upstate New York. He's got a cattle farm there, beef cattle farm. But his family also has a ranch in Argentina. So Brett is in a very unique situation where he is going to compare and contrast 2 beef cattle operations on 2 different continents and give us a little story with that.
All right, it's 5 o'clock, meaning no more charts and graphs here. We're going to have a bit of fun with this. Cornell doesn't really have a grazing specialist, so they sent their forester instead to talk to you about forages today, but there is a reason they did that. Long story short, 30 years ago this year actually, 31 years ago this year, my wife's hitting me up the back of the head here, Maria and I met, and Argentina they not only have good soccer teams, they have beautiful women, young guy there working. It was bound to happen. And on our wedding, or the day before our wedding, we walked in with our life savings and everything we could beg, borrow, and steal, and plopped down money at the land lawyer's office and bought a little ranch in the central mountains of Argentina. And for the next 10 years, we had no money or time to do much with it, but then the kids came along and we ended up moving to the family's former dairy farm in upstate New York. I grew up in the Watkins Glen area, so I'm going to share with you just a little bit about how we cope with this little situation called the non-growing season on both of these ranches. And I guess I should credit the family and some close friends for making all of this possible, because Cornell gets the first 50 hours a week, and then the farms get whatever's left. But if it wasn't for great people on both ends in New York and Argentina, much of what I'm sharing wouldn't have happened. So you can see some of the similarities there between the landscapes and the type of cattle. Interestingly enough, we're both cow-calf operations. We have about 100 what I would call grass-bred cows. These are the Shetland pony versions of the Angus breed, not the thoroughbred versions. They're bred to do well with pretty minimal inputs, although we feel we take good care of our cattle. We just don't like feeding them corn silage and, sorry Andy, but brassicas, things like that. And rotational grazing is obviously an important part of both operations. We rotationally graze to the extent practical, not necessarily possible, but to the extent practical. It's a daily rotation on the New York farm and more of a weekly rotation on the Argentina ranch. As you could see in the previous picture, there we have, it's pretty rugged, pretty rolling hills. and something you wouldn't expect, but it rains about 40 inches or 1,000 millimeters a year at both places. It's just the distribution of that rain is quite different. And so in Argentina, we have to rely on year-round grazing. I'll talk more about why in a moment, but it has to do with access. And consequently, and we strive to graze about 8 months from mid-April to mid-December on the New York farm, which is probably a couple months longer than anyone else in the neighborhood. And then in New York, of course, we're contending with this little thing called winter and all the joys it brings with it of mud and snow and some pretty extremely cold temperatures, although Vern's probably laughing at me, you know, it's like come to Saskatchewan or something, -40 in the winter. When your family station wagon is a Unimog, you know that the access isn't that great. So that's basically why we have to rely on year-round grazing in Argentina, because you're not going to haul hay into a location like this. And pretty much every acre that can grow a forage crop in Argentina has been plowed up in the last 20 years to grow soybean for the other ends of the world. So it's hay would be difficult to procure even if we could figure out creative ways to maybe airdrop it into the ranch. You know, you can see there, these are all kind of winter pictures, and their winters characterized by mild and dry, sometimes cold, but still dry. And with that, it brings some unique challenges. Range fires are probably our biggest constant threat. We've had a couple fires, extensive regional fires, pretty much wipe us out. And these always seem to come, of course, at the end of the winter period when the cows are in their weakest condition. And your stockpiles are, fortunately though, usually the lowest then. And the cattle are a very fundamental part. You can see a lot of trees in these pictures. The Argentines like to joke that God gave them great soil and rainfall and climate and then forgot to put the trees there. Well, these big ranching operations in central Argentina have been trying to correct that for the last 40 years. My work there 30 years ago was to train the gauchos how to be loggers. I was highly unsuccessful. They quickly realized logging was hard work and it was more fun to punch cattle on horseback, but I learned a lot from it. Met Maria there. So we continue to try to use the cattle herd as our workforce to manage the fuel loads to minimize these fire risks. And even though a variety of hardwood trees will grow well there, we tend to plant more of these fire-resistant conifer species like loblolly and slash pine. And the trees provide many important benefits beyond just a timber crop. You can see there, when we have to take hay in after a big fire, the effort that goes into that. And 2 bales doesn't feed 100 pairs very long. The upper picture there, if you're wondering what that is, so the 2 times we've been burned out, we plant a lot of hybrid willows on kind of the wetter and riparian areas, and usually they're leafed out by late winter, and we've had to go in there and use them as a fodder source to sustain the herd. And it's not going to really fill their bellies, but it definitely gives them something better than just rocks and ash to eat. And then we can supplement that with a little bit of hay and a little bit of concentrate in the form of corn. So, you know, by contrast, in New York, we have plenty of precipitation, not a very high fire risk in the middle of winter. In upstate New York, we have to contend with other things, though, like polar vortexes and blizzards. And we figured out creative ways to outwinter our cattle. We have really no structures on the old dairy farm that would come even close to housing but a fraction of our herd. Last time I priced out basically a pole structure that would be big enough for kind of emergency shelter for our animals. We were looking at, and this was pre-inflation, it was about $300,000 then. You have to, as the Argentines would say, sell a lot of pot loads of calves to pay for that one. So we use our various conifer plantations around the farm as our living barns. You can see the one aerial image there. We do extensive bale grazing. We've been doing it for about 18, 19 years now. Took us, it was a little trepid at first, like, are the cows going to die because we didn't put them in a muddy barnyard for the winter, but it's been awesome. And everything Greg says about the benefits are true. And then, of course, you have to figure out some of these other little things, like how do you get water to the animals in sub-freezing temperatures. So just in conclusion here, there's always room for improvement. We've been grazing now, 25 years in Argentina and about 20 since we shifted away from the kind of the dairying in New York. And I think that you can always do a better job of managing your stocking density, but it's easier said than done in a place where, you have to use a unimog to reach the ranch, so you're not going to just load animals on a trailer and take them off. But we probably need to do a better job with calling out animals before they really need to be called out. And I think in New York we could be grazing more of our hay ground, and again, that's just one of those things that I'm sure once we start doing it more broadly, we'll be like, why didn't we do this 10 years ago? Because it's usually not cost effective to do a second cutting in our area anyhow. And we will never run out of room for improving our pastures and our silvopastures. Silvopasturing is another story for another time. But as you can see, we love our trees and our grazing systems. And, in Argentina, I think we can still plant a lot more trees, hardwoods that we can use as an emergency food source for those drought years and those winter range fires situations, and better herd management. As I said earlier, just calling out animals and probably doing a better job of the seasonal calving. It's it's not really high tensile fence country where you keep the bulls on the right side of the fence all the time, so the calving season kind of happens when it happens. We try really hard, but the bull tries really hard too. So, and one thing we probably couldn't improve on in Argentina is the barbecues, or the so-called asados, and this is the celebratory meal in my in-laws' town when they won the World Cup in December. So that's 150 sides of beef if you can't count that fast before. I think the whole town showed up for that one, and I can only imagine the red wine they drank with that. So that's it. I think we're still on track. So
We have lots of time for questions.
all right, lots of time for comments, questions. And by the way, if anybody needs to rush to happy hour, feel free. I won't be offended. Yes.
I don't know if everybody can hear me. What other tree species could you consider for fodder use?
Yeah, so, well, in New York, where, it's funny how that dry winter can really limit the species. So dry cold seems to be much more detrimental to many trees, especially deciduous trees or hardwood trees, than wet cold. And nonetheless, we do have some good growing sites that can sustain hardwood trees. And I think that we need to be planting more soft mast and hard mast producing trees. Honey locust would be one, although honey locust, whoever brought the first honey locust seed to Argentina must have picked the scrubbiest, ugliest honey locust in the world, and it's basically turned into, I never thought of trees as invasive, but it's kind of invasive. And but there are other trees, Kentucky coffee tree, oaks do very well. Any place you see southern yellow pine growing, oaks have potential there. Black locust is more of a summer fodder. So we have, I enjoyed the talk about Bermuda grass, because that'll tend to dominate the best growing sites and the overgrazed sites, and you can't stop that stuff. The more you graze it, the better it grows, it seems. So, but many of the grass you probably notice are basically, I call them like a wire grass or a bunch grass. These grass are high in silica. We do try to keep a little bit of Brahma blood crossed in with the Angus because their teeth will wear out in like six to 8 years if you don't. But it's rugged country. Yes. Anyone else? No, everybody's ready for, yes, John? Yeah. So all the details are in the papers we had to submit, right? But we have a stocking rate of about 30 acres per pair in the ranch in Argentina. And, you know, sometimes, so in New York, it's about 5 acres per pair. And that's not all high quality pasture. It includes some of the kind of underdeveloped silvo pastures and such on our farm. I often wonder though if our stocking rate was 1 pair per 30 acres in New York, could we graze year round? Probably. I'm sure we could. It'd be, you know, you might have to go out there and break the ice sometimes or the crust on the snow. There are grazers in our area that are now pushing the envelope. They're consistently grazing 10 months in our area, which is probably sounds like no big deal in Arkansas, but it's pretty phenomenal for us. So, but the average status quo herd's still grazing 5 months a year, maybe 6 in a wetter year, and feeding hay the rest. So, everybody learned today, right, that feeding hay is expensive. Okay, if you take nothing else away. In Brassicas, Andy, I don't know if he left there, but maybe, I don't know, did we get a cost comparison there on the brassica feeding to hay feeding? I don't know. I'm sure it's high quality stuff, though. Yeah, I'm jealous of all of you putting up pictures of being able to seed stuff. If we move soil in our area, it's just the cobblestone that comes up. It's all glaciated soils and far more rock content than soil content in our soils in upstate New York. All right, well, thank you very much, everybody. I'll be hanging around here for a little bit, so if you got any good stories to tell or I don't know, want to talk about that picture there or something, I'll be here. Yes?
Personal question, when you retire, what do you want to do?
When I grow up, yeah, so we plan to split the year between Argentina and New York. And now that our kids are all kind of grown up and moved on, the youngest will actually graduate from West Point next week, and he's our last one in college. So, you know, we're getting closer, and one's married and one's about to get married. So we've dreamed for literally 30 years of spending more time in Argentina, and the kids love it there. And you know, they're none of them are going to be farmers, but they appreciate the farm, and I think they'll, you know, the farms will be part of their families' lives too, and that makes it all worth it in hindsight. So, thank you.